Dialogue. That is not dialogue. Open and free.
Your turn. If you want to break the ice, you will break it.
We were actually just talking about the conflict between Israel and Palestine, and I guess, I don't know, I just want to hear your general opinions, because I think they're really interesting.
Well, the idea of a conflict between Israel and Palestine is a little misleading. There's conflict between one. Excuse me. It's a conflict, whatever it may have been in the past, for the last 40 years approximately. It's a conflict between an extremely powerful state and the people who it's crushing. It's occupying illegally, taking over the land and territory, carrying out savage actions against them, and with the United States, it can do nothing apart from what the United States permits. So Israel is basically an appendage of the United States. When I say Israel, I mean U.S. and Israel, have been since 1971 blocking unilaterally any attempt at a political and diplomatic resolution of the conflict. So it's a conflict in a sense, but sort of misleading, very misleading sense. I mean, there is a global agreement, broad international consensus, has been since for 30 years, on an appropriate resolution of the conflict. It came up before the United Nations Security Council in January 1976 for the first time, so that's 30 years. And it's a call for a political settlement on the internationally recognized border. It's the pre-June 1967 border, with minor and mutual accommodations, modifications. That's the official U.S. government terminology. 67 border with minor and mutual accommodations in a two-state settlement. Well, that resolution was brought in 1976 by what are called the confrontation states, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, three major states bordering Israel. They brought the resolution. Israel refused to attend the session. The United States vetoed the resolution. That's the beginning. I go through the rest of the record, but that's the beginning of the process that goes up until today. Now, when the United States vetoes something, it's a double veto. First of all, it blocks it, and secondly, it vetoes it from history. So you won't read it in the media. You'll only read it in scholarship if you look at very specialist scholarship. General histories of the region, even by scholars, won't mention it. And the same is true of the rest of the history. And meanwhile, the United States and Israel are systematically taking over the valuable land, the resources, breaking up the rest of the region into the occupied region, and it's all illegal. I mean, it's a gross violation of any of the conventions. That's agreed even by the United States. Israel's the only country that questions that. Theoretically, it's agreed to by the United States, not in practice. And the current version, just to skip to the present, is a policy which we've read about called convergence. That's Israel's policy. In U.S. commentary, and also pretty much Europe, so in Western commentary, primarily the U.S., this is called a courageous withdrawal proposal. Actually, it's a proposal of annexation, dismemberment, and imprisonment. The proposal is to annex parts of the West Bank, and they happen to be the parts with the most valuable land and with the resources, the main resources, water, for that region. And this will annex the water resources. It's dismemberment because it breaks up the shrinking areas to be left Palestinians into separated cantons, virtually separated, a little bit of contact, but virtually separated cantons, completely unviable. All of them separated from whatever sliver of East Jerusalem will be left to the Palestinians. Symbolically, Jerusalem's the traditional center of educational, commercial, political life, all institutions. And it's all imprisonment because Israel, meaning U.S. and Israel, are annexing the Jordan Valley. Look at the map, that means it's imprisoned. Imprisoned, dismembered, and substantial parts annexed, all in violation of international law. Unambiguously. The many Security Council resolutions, which the U.S. in fact has endorsed, have been rejected. The International Court of Justice, World Court, ruled on the wall, then they called it the separation wall, it should now be called an annexation wall. They ruled on the wall 2 years ago, and the unanimous ruling, including the U.S. Justice, was that the wall is in violation of the Geneva Conventions, hence in violation of international law, grave breach of international law. The U.S. Justice, if you read the newspapers and commentary, you'll read that the U.S. Justice did not support the resolution, which is technically true. He issued a separate declaration. He didn't join the unanimous judgment of the court. He issued a separate declaration in which he said that any part of the wall that is being constructed to protect Israeli settlements is ipso facto in violation of international law. Those are his words. Ipso facto settlements are in violation of international law. That's the U.S. Justice, Justice Bergenfeld, and the rest of the court was unanimous. But the United States is an outlaw state. It is officially committed to violating international law when it wants to. And Israel goes as far as the United States will allow it to. So the procedures continue.
What do you think about the Unity actions in North Korea and North Korea rejecting
North Korea is a hideous, maybe the most hideous place on earth. Nobody wants to say anything good about it. But this is the part of my comments which is eliminated from the press when they report what I say. This is just reported that way. But that aside, North Korea has a case. The U.S. is threatening it with destruction. The U.S. has refused negotiations. Refused. They claim that they're negotiating. The only way the U.S. will negotiate is part of a 6-country negotiating team. North Korea has been calling for face-to-face negotiations on all issues. The U.S. has refused. Actually, there was an agreement. Look back a little bit. In 1994, the conflict came pretty close to war. The Clinton administration was planning military exercises to take out the North Korean plans. But they reached an agreement. It's called the Framework Agreement. Under the Framework Agreement, North Korea was to stop enrichment of plutonium, development of plutonium. And the United States, in return, was to provide a variety of forms of aid, like actually nuclear energy, other kind of humanitarian aid, and so on, and to withdraw threats to attack. Well, that agreement was partially lived up to. Both sides violated it to a limited extent, but to a substantial extent, it was sustained. And in fact, North Korea did not produce plutonium during this period. When George Bush came into office, one of the first things he did was to withdraw the agreement, along with a whole range of other international agreements. But they withdrew this one. They claimed that U.S. intelligence had detected North Korean violations. Now, I don't have to tell you that when the White House states that U.S. intelligence detected something or other, the credibility of that is somewhere around the level of my 2-year-old grandson saying he didn't steal the candy. But can put that aside. But we have no evidence. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. But so the U.S. pulled out of the agreement, and North Korea once returned to publicly producing, enriching uranium. Well, it continues through negotiations. The most recent one was September 2005. So it's approximately a year ago. The North Korea and the 6 nations, United States, China, South Korea, Japan, Russia, I think that's it, agreed to that North Korea would stop enrichment of uranium, and the U.S. would withdraw its efforts to overthrow the government. And that was the agreement. 4 days later, the Treasury Department imposed new heavy sanctions on Korea, on international banks dealing with Korea and so on. Well, the North Korean leadership apparently took this to be an indication that the United States simply will not negotiate in good faith. So it seems, I'm really not just quoting specialists on North Korea, as Elliot Harrison and others, it seems that they took this to mean that they have to raise the stakes, raise the ante, to get the U.S. to pay some attention. So they went ahead and carried out a nuclear test. Then comes the next step. One possibility is to make it harsher, to impose harsher conditions. Another step would be, the alternative would be to re-enter the negotiations. Now that's what's proposed by, in my view, I think that's the right approach. That's what the South Koreans want. That's what many U.S. specialists on nuclear energy, Elliot Harris for one, Senator Sam Nunn, who was the leading figure in conservative Republican senators, the leading figure in arms control negotiations for many years. He's called for that, and others, and I think they're right. I mean, if you raise the level of tension, you will raise it to the level of possible nuclear war. Is there a possibility of negotiated settlement? Looks like it. We don't know that there isn't. The North Korean regime is desperate to maintain itself in power. It shouldn't be maintained in power for the benefit of the population. That's not our choice. That's for the Koreans to work out. They don't want to be overthrown and destroyed. And if all they're really asking is a pledge by the United States to not to attack. So a non-aggression pact, something like that. Let the U.S. refuse to. So we're up to sanctions, and the sanctions are interpreted differently. The UN resolution is purposely imprecise to allow different interpretations. If you turn on CNN or BBC or other news sources that are fundamentally run by the White House, including BBC, then the picture is, well, the North Koreans are refusing to accept the sanctions, and China's backing off from the sanctions, and so on. If you actually read the resolution, and you don't reflexively accept U.S. propaganda, then it's more complex. The resolution, in fact, was passed with ambiguity, so otherwise it wouldn't have been passed. And it allows each country to interpret it in its own way. So China is interpreting its way, Russia its way, South Korea its way. The U.S. and Japan, which are the most aggressive, are interpreting it a different way. And it's the U.S. interpretation that dominates coverage and commentary, at least in the U.S. and Europe, and certainly in the rest of the world. I mean, if we had access to Al Jazeera, I'm sure we'd hear a different story.
Let's turn to this part of the world. South America, Chile. The president was the first woman who would run Chile. And in this South American or Latin American context, what do you think about, this could represent to a new social movement, like Bolivia, or Venezuela, or Ecuador? What opportunities can this social movement happened in Chile. To develop political in this South American countries.
First of all, I'll just give you my opinion and impressions, but let me tell you first not to pay much attention to it. I mean, it's superficial. I don't really know the situation in depth, the nature of the countries, but the superficial impression I've had, both from visiting South America and from reading a lot about it, is that Chile, I mean, all the countries of South America, most of them, lived through horrendous military dictatorship. Started in Brazil in 1964. The Kennedy administration basically planned a military dictatorship to overthrow the Goulart government, the elected government. The coup was carried out right after Kennedy's assassination, already planned. And that set off a wave of, really a plague of repression, violence throughout the hemisphere, worse than anything in its history. I mean, one after another. One case, there was dictatorship in Uruguay. The worst of all was Argentina, the late 70s. Then came the massive atrocities in the 1980s in Central America. It's just been a horror story ever since then. Most of the countries have come out of it, more or less. So in Argentina, which had the worst military dictatorship by far, they probably killed about 30,000 people. It's just a horror story. They actually had emerged psychologically free from the dictatorship. And I think the reason was the Falklands-Malvinas War. The military made a bad mistake. In fact, I remember last time I was in Chile, people were quietly telling me they wished the Chilean army was stupid enough to go to war with France or somebody so they could get smashed and be discredited and then people would be free. Well, they weren't that stupid. In Argentina they were. So the military was completely discredited. It used to be the place where the elite young people from elite families, young men, would go to join the army for the prestigious thing to do. It doesn't happen anymore. And nobody pays much attention to the military. It's pretty much the same as in Brazil. It's true in Brazil. But for one reason, because the Brazilian military dictatorship, while it was pretty bad, was not as awful as the others. And for another, because Brazil is such a complex, uncontrollable, varied country, that it's undisciplined country, that it's just, the military never had that much effective power and was discredited. Chile is different. In Chile, the impression I've always had is that the dictatorship, the military dictatorship is still there psychologically. People don't want to confront it. It's not there in the sense that they're going to carry out a military coup, but the residue has remained. And part of the residue is a feeling of helplessness or apathy or turning somewhere else or being atomized or not wanting to confront authority and pursue options. I mean, in a sense, the Chilean abstention at the UN vote was a characteristic of the country. The population abstains. It doesn't do things that it could do. But I'm sure that a considerable majority of the population here would want to undo a lot of the regulations of the dictatorship, obstructing the health system, the effects on the educational system, and so on. And the vote, the free vote, many people want to get rid of it. But people don't do it because you just don't confront authority. You stay home, keep your own business, nothing else. It's an effect of terror that is seen in many places. But just to give another example, some of the worst state terror was in fact the worst. It was in Central America in the 1980s. U.S. terror was worse in Central America, which were really grotesque. Actually, the worst was Guatemala. So unbelievably ironic that Guatemala be considered for the Security Council. Never emerged. Half a century of terror since the U.S. overthrew the democratic government. In the 1980s, total horror story. The other state that was equally almost destroyed was El Salvador. Really mass murder. A lot of it directed against the church. In 1994, so a couple of years after the state terror stopped, technically there was peace and formally democratic government. In 1994, there was a conference, a revealing conference, run by the Jesuits in El Salvador. That is, the Jesuits who survived and now were assassinated by U.S.-run armed forces and so on. But some survived, and they ran a conference. They produced a document, a very interesting document, which you will not discover in the United States or the West unless you read this in literature, because that's not the kind of thing that people like us are supposed to know, supposed to express it. But the document was interesting. They discussed the effect of a decade of state terror on the population. And what they concluded was that the terror lead, which is pretty awful, leads what they call a culture of terror. Culture of terror is marked by the fact that, I'm quoting it now, that the aspirations of the population are domesticated. They reduce their aspirations. And they conform to the interests of the powerful, reflexive. That's the effect of the culture of terror. And it happens in many ways. I mean, partly just keep quiet, or keep your own pursuits, or private money, or something or other. But you don't get together in front of authority, even if you could. I have the feeling, and again, I'll take it seriously, it's a superficial impression, but the feeling I've had about Chile is that it's kind of under a culture of terror, in the sense described by the Salvadoran Jesuits. So, although the options are there, as you described, I think it'll take a kind of psychological breakthrough for them to realize. Many of you know the situation much better than I do, so you can correct me, but that's since you asked, that's the impression.
Do you know David Horowitz?
Pardon?
David Horowitz?
David Horowitz? Yeah.
What do you think of him?
I don't know him very well. He was a active Marxist-Leninist in the 1960s. And most intelligent young guy. Personally, I must have avoided him in context. In the late, the early 19th, he was sort of close to the Communist Party, I think. And in the early around 1970, he became involved with the Black Panthers, which many people say is me too. Because he's accessible. Involved with the Black Panthers, you had to recognize that it was a mixture of very different groups. I mean, some elements of the Panthers were perfectly serious organizers. Like Fred Hampton, who was assassinated in a Gestapo-style police assassination set up by the FBI. Another one of those things you're not supposed to know. He was assassinated because he was a serious black organizer in the ghetto. And some of them were. Some of them were criminal gangs, straight criminal gangs. Some were running a kind of a scam. They were exploiting white guilt trips. There was a lot of that. A good friend of mine went to jail for 20 years because she was caught up and got out recently. And it was a kind of a complicated mixture. Horowitz apparently got caught up in it and didn't understand what he was doing, and got somehow indirectly involved in the murder of a friend of his within the Panthers, and then he kind of disappeared for a while and went through some psychological crisis. He came out of right-wing, realizing that the way to fame and fortune is to shriek and scream about the left. And since then he's been, what he produces is just lunacy, but very well funded. And popular in mainstream, because he's saying things that people want to hear. But the intellectual content of it, you can figure out yourself. I didn't think it had much intellectual content when he was a Marxist-Leninist, and much less. But I haven't been anything specific. But I think it's general.
Dr. Chomsky, the term weak state or failed state has become very important in the international relations studies after in the post-Cold War era. What I want to ask you is about this called weak state.
Weak state or failed state? Those are different notions.
Failed state.
Failed state.
Excuse me. About the failed state, and I want you to focus about the UN peacekeeping operations that are developed in those countries. How could we avoid an intervention from stronger countries, like United States or European, Western Europe countries, and how can avoid those countries do not interfere in the will of the people who live in those failed countries in political development?
Well, first let me say a word about the concepts. I mean, it happens that I just wrote a book called Failed States about 6 months ago. But the state that I was talking about is the United States. That's why failed state has nothing to do with weak state. So Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union are typical failed states, but they weren't weak. Quite the contrary. Saddam Hussein's Iraq was a failed state, but it wasn't weak. A failed state, if you look at the concept, is a state that is either unwilling or unable to protect its citizens from violence or maybe even destruction. It's an outlaw state that declares its immunity to international law and conventions. And it's a state that may have democratic institutions, but they don't function. Well, if you look carefully, the United States meets every one of those criteria. So that's failed state. But when in the propaganda system, when you talk about failed states, you mean ones with the United States and its allies want to do something about, not ourselves. And the question you raised with regard to that category is a serious one. So you have to, I don't think it's a general. I mean, there are plenty of places where there's an argument. Well, there always has to be a very strong argument for the use of force everywhere. Personal affairs, international affairs, wherever it is. But if you argue for the use of force, you have a strong burden of proof to it. Always. Sometimes you can imagine cases. There are real cases where you barely prove, but you have to show. And there are international situations where you can make a case that force should be applied, or at least sanctions should be applied. Actually, not very many, in my opinion. So, for example, in the case of South Africa, I think sanctions, nobody advocated invasion, but sanctions were legitimate, I think. Unfortunately, they weren't applied. Formally, they were applied, but the U.S. and Britain, the main countries, evaded them. So Congress passed sanctions, but the Reagan administration avoided them. In fact, trade with South Africa increased after the sanctions. In fact, here Israel became very useful. It turned out to be an avenue by which the United States and Britain could evade the sanctions by arranging for Israel to ship oil and other needs. In fact, during the decade of the sanctions, 1980s, the United States effectively backed South Africa, not only what it was doing inside, but attacks in Angola and Mozambique, which probably killed over 1 million people. Wasn't a joke. Nevertheless, sanctions would have been justified if they had been imposed in words. And you can think of other cases. What about military intervention? Well, you have to look at the individual cases. I don't think you can give a formula. So, for example, right now, the case that's big on the international agenda is Darfur. Why is Darfur? I mean, it's undoubtedly a horror story. It's by no means the worst. I mean, in eastern Congo, several million people have been killed in the last several years. In Darfur, it's claimed that 200,000 were killed. Well, that's pretty bad. But there's an interesting fact about those claims. The claims of 200,000 been killed, which I think are probably correct, that come from careful, serious demographic studies done by major institutions which have to be treated with respect, like Johns Hopkins School of Medicine and others. And their estimate is, well, maybe 200,000 been killed. Well, those very same institutions have carried out even more detailed studies in Iraq, where they say that since the U.S. invasion, 650,000 have been killed. When that's even mentioned in the press, which is rare, it's called a controversial statement, a controversial conclusion. George Bush got on television and said the methodology has been discredited. He's a famous social scientist. It's published in the major medical journal in the world, Lancet. Its editor wrote an article, which couldn't publish in the United States, in which he said, well, if the methodology has been discredited, then we have to withdraw what you're saying about Darfur, the same methodology. Again, those things you're not supposed to know, so forget it. It's true. But it's probably correct in both cases. All right, so what should you do, say? And first of all, why is Darfur a huge issue, not worse atrocities? Well, it's a question you ought to ask yourself. And I think the reason is pretty transparent. I mean, in the case of Darfur, you can blame the atrocities on Arabs, and they are the official enemy. Okay. So since you can blame the atrocity on Arabs, it's kind of a good atrocity, serves a political purpose. On the other hand, is there any suggestion of doing anything about it? I mean, you read editorial after editorial, you watch people pontificating on television, and so on and so forth, about how we must do something, we can't let this go on. Here's a research project. See if you can find one proposal that is not of the form, let's you do something. Okay? I haven't found one. Everything is, yeah, terrible, we have to do something about it, you do it. I mean, has anybody proposed, for example, that the U.S. send troops? Out of the question. Did Britain send troops? Can you conceive of France? Well, certainly not. How do you do something about it? We'll pontificate about it. So we'll stand up on television and say, we're all for him, horrible, and so on, but no proposal. Well, okay, and in fact, if you look at the specialists on Darfur, people who really care about it, and the people who aren't just trying to make political points out of it, there are some very good ones, like Alex DeWall, a major specialist on Eastern Africa, who knows about it. He was very cautious. He doesn't come out with, he says, yes, it's atrocity, but he doesn't come out with specific proposals about sending military force. Because when you send military force to a country, you're hitting a complicated system with a sledgehammer. And all kind of things can happen that you may not anticipate, particularly if you don't know anything about the country. Now, for example, there's a whole lot of, there's civil war, there are intertribal rivalries, there's all kind of things going on. And they could be exacerbated. So you have to, if you're going to use force in any situation, you have to think it through, figure out what the consequences are going to be for the people, and maybe you can make a case. But if you do make a case, then the case has to be, okay, I'll do it, not you do it. And it's hard to find cases like that. In fact, if you look at the legal literature, there's a big legal literature in international law on the humanitarian intervention. It goes back a couple of centuries. If you look through the literature, there's big books on it and find in the International Law Library, it's very hard to find even one authentic example. I mean, everything is called humanitarian intervention. I mean, even Hitler's invasion of Poland, everything's called humanitarian. And the conquistadors, for example, it's called humanitarian intervention. They offer you the opportunity, Christians, to save your souls, what is more humanitarian than that? But to try to find an authentic case is another research project. The case where where the goal was actually humanitarian, not covering some other power interest. It's not very easy to find. You can make up a couple of cases, but hard to argue. And the reason is it's not the kind of thing that states tend to do. States are not benevolent agents. They're instruments of power. We're working typically for concentrations of power within. So a humanitarian intervention is sort of like a benevolent act on the part of a corporation, not part of the institutional structure. Actually, in the case of corporations, it's actually illegal. Illegal. In the case of states, it's not illegal. And, there could be cases. I mean, you get maybe the British intervention in Sierra Leone. There's a couple of other cases you can imagine. But the use of force is not something to be undertaken lightly. First, at least you have to figure out, think through carefully what the consequences are going to be for the population. And it can be complicated. And that's why in you can take, say, domestic situations, domestic abuse, let's say. I mean, in a civilized country, the police don't come in with guns for us. They try to negotiate with us.
I can totally assume your answer, but I'll ask anyway. With the midterm elections coming up in November in the United States, and it's looking like political leadership might change, do you think that will influence, if it does in fact occur, do you think that will influence our foreign policy?
Let's just imagine for the moment that we had something called like newspapers. Or we had the serious intellectuals who were interested in talking about reality. They wouldn't be talking about the midterm elections because they're not really taking place. I mean, if you take a look at the House of Representatives, there are 435 seats. Of those seats, about 35 are contested. The rest are just not contested. Of the 35, you can pretty well predict the outcome by just asking which candidate has more corporate funding. That leaves a scattering of choices among 435 delegates. One of the reasons why so few are contested is that in the last recent years there's been a tremendous amount of gerrymandering, redrawing districts to ensure that the incumbents, the ruling party, will stay in. In fact, in the last election, 2004, the Republicans would have lost seats in the House if it hadn't been for the Texas delegation, which redrew the boundaries in complicated ways to ensure that they disenfranchised most of the population. Well, that's what we call an election. I mean, if you really compare it, let's say, the Communist Party in Russia had elections too. Then there was some choice, a couple of options were available between different members of the Communist Party. We didn't call it elections. We call it a farce. Now, if you look back at the constitutional system that was put in place in the 1780s, it was carefully contrived. The House of Representatives was intended to be the more democratic component of the various parts of the system. It was closer to the population, vote every 2 years, small districts, and therefore it was given much less power. Power was to be in the hands of the Senate, which is, Madison put it, the Senate is the wealth of the nation, the more responsible group of men, those who have sympathy for property and its rights. They're the ones who have the real power, but the House is the democratic component. Throwing a couple of little raw meat to the public, which was democratic. The leadership was not. Well, that's the House that's coming up, Senate even less. So the elections are, in the first place, are a very marginal affair. That's one of the respects in which I think the United States is taking on characteristics of a failed state, democratic institutions, but not functioning. But it goes well beyond that. The two political parties are well to the right of the population on a wide range of major issues, and we know that. The U.S. is a very free country, most in the world. It's very lot of information about public attitudes, very carefully studied. Major polling institutions, they publish important studies, press won't report them, but they're there and you can find them. And go through a lot of them in this recent book, in fact. But what they show is that if you look at domestic and international issues, by and large, the public's excluded. Because the parties are too far to the right. They don't represent the public. They represent the power concentrations, concentrated power. And that's true on, I mean, let's take the leading domestic issue in the United States. For the population, the general population, and this has been true in polls for a long time, either the leading or one of the leading issues is healthcare. The U.S. healthcare system is a total catastrophe. It's the worst in the industrial world by far, with choice, not far below. And so you've got twice the per capita costs of other industrial societies. It has among the worst outcomes in the industrial world. And the reason is transparent. It's privatized. It's the only privatized system. So that means lots of bureaucracy and administration and paperwork and filling out forms and cherry picking healthy people by the insurance company, all sorts of stuff. Many of you who are from the United States, when you're too young, as you get older, to my age, you find out pretty quickly. You try to get anything done, you know, it's like a nightmare. When the there was a bill passed written by the pharmaceutical corporations 2 years ago to provide drug care for the elderly. That was supposed to be a wonderful thing. I mean, the government sent around to every person in that category, who's again on the web, sent around a booklet, about 100 pages of the booklet. I mean, it would take you 6 months and free research assistance to figure out what it means, literally. I mean, then it has all sorts of options, you know, you do this and get that, and nobody could do it. I mean, unless you really made that's typical government bureaucracy for a privatized system. You impose, you have a government-created private system, it's going to be a total wreck. So I think it's approximately the same. So, and it's for the population, it's a huge problem. I mean, many people, maybe 30–40% of the population, simply don't defer essential health care because they can't afford it. They can't afford drugs. So, so you look at polls, that's the most serious problem. And furthermore, for decades, a large majority of the public is in favor of a national health care system. Poll after poll cannot appear on the electoral agenda. Neither political party will support it. They won't even discuss it. It's just not on the agenda. And the reason is very simple. They don't represent the population. They represent corporate power. And the financial institutions are opposed, and the HMOs are opposed, and the banks are opposed, and so on. In fact, the only thing that's possible in our system, U.S. system, the only thing that's likely to change it is that manufacturing industries are now beginning to oppose the crazy healthcare system because it's costing them too much. So to produce a car in Detroit costs about $1,500 more than to produce it right across the border in Windsor, Canada, same car, same corporation, because of the crazed healthcare costs. So the manufacturing industries are starting to lobby for national, sometimes sane healthcare system. But in a failed state, that's the only way things change. The population can't get into the act. And the same is true on international issues. I'll just give you one example. Pick, say, global warming, which, may destroy possibilities of life. Well, the population is concerned about it. Pick, say, the Kyoto Protocol. You read in the press that the United States refused to sign it, which actually kills it. Which is true only if you interpret the United States as excluding its population. The population is strongly in favor of it. In fact, so strongly in favor that the majority of Bush voters thought that he was in favor of it. One of the properties of a failed state is that things are designed so that the electorate doesn't know the stands of the candidates on issues. one case. The population is so strongly in favor of it, they took for granted, even Bush voters, that he's in favor of it. Obviously he isn't. And this runs through issue after issue. So will something change if the Democrats take a slight majority? Probably. A somewhat different constituency. So they cater to the majority voting population. But it's unlikely much will change. And you can sort of see what's happened. And the last year has been a very interesting year in U.S. political history. The Republicans have been shooting themselves in the foot every week. Every week something happens and just total disaster. I mean, Iraq, Katrina, corruption, whatever it is. And the Democrats don't make any gains. If it was an opposition party, they'd be making huge gains. But the only gains the Democrats are getting are that the Republicans are losing. But support for both parties is declining. Democrats are making no gains from it. And the reason is they're not an opposition party. It's kind of like Bush Lights.
I don't feel like the Democrats are offering anything to the game. Well, the Democrats don't seem to be offering much. They have ideas, but they're not setting plans.
What are their ideas?
Yeah.
Do you know? I
suppose.
I don't know. I mean, like, say the last election. What was Kerry's position on health care?
Yeah. No. Well, and that's one thing that there's not a plan that's going into motion.
Well, there's not a plan because they don't want the public to know.
Yeah.
I mean, there are exceptions, not overgeneralizing. There's exceptions. But by and large, they don't want the public to know their stand on issues because the public's opposed to their stand on issues. That you can see that if you watch an election campaign in the United States. Actually, this is increasingly true of other Western democracies as well. They're like 10 years behind. They sort of follow. But by now in the United States, elections are about at the level of television ads. Like if you watch an ad on television for a lifestyle drug or a toothpaste or an automobile or something, you don't expect to get information. Right? You're not looking at the ad to get information. Everybody knows that. You're going to be deluded by imagery. So General Motors doesn't say, here are the characteristics of the cars I'm going to produce next year, which is what would happen in a free market system. What they do is show an actress or a football player with a car climbing into the stratosphere or something or other, and you're supposed to be deluded by it. But everyone knows that. Okay? Every one of you who's taken an economics course knows that what you're being taught is total nonsense. I mean, you're being taught that a market society, like ours supposedly, is based on informed consumers making rational choices. You study rational choice theory and mathematical models and so on. Is that what's going on? I mean, is business spending hundreds of billions of dollars a year to create informed consumers making rational choices? I mean, every one of us knows that they're spending hundreds of billions a year to create uninformed consumers making irrational choices. It's the whole point of advertising. Well, as the same industries take over the electoral system, which increasingly they've been doing, and by now it's almost total, they market candidates the same way they market toothpaste. So you're deluded by imagery. They don't tell you what they stand for any more than a television ad tells you the characteristics of the product. The television ad, the candidate ads might as well say, vote for so-and-so, my friend says he's good for me, or something, that kind of thing. And that's on purpose. You want to marginalize the population, ensure that the democratic system doesn't function, that the powerful sectors effectively run it in isolation. It all makes sense. And Europe is not that far behind. You look at a European election, they're sort of moving in that direction. It'll take a little while before they get that sophisticated. And it's so that the choices among the parties are pretty slight. I'm not zero. And if you do comparative studies, again, kind of interesting. so take, say, Spain, which is very far from a model democracy. But in Spain, in March 2004, there was an important election. There was an issue. I mean, it wasn't, the issue was there almost by accident. And the issue had to do with troops in Iraq. What happened, if you remember, is that there was a bombing in Madrid, and the government immediately blamed it on ETA and Basque nationalists, and the press all quickly got into line, blamed it on them, and so on. But a couple of days before the election, the story sort of fell apart, and it was determined that it was probably Al-Qaeda or at least Muslim terrorist group. Well, right after that came the election. Now it was clear to anybody with a brain that the bombing was some kind of retaliation for Spanish forces in Iraq. So that became the issue in the election. So there was an issue, almost by accident, but there was an issue. And in fact, the government voted out. And the party that won, you wouldn't know this if you read the Western press, it did not call for withdrawing troops. They did not, contrary to what was reported. What they called for was the leaving troops in Iraq only under UN supervision. Okay. That was what they voted for. Well, no UN authority, the US won't allow it, so therefore they withdrew the troops. Well, what was not reported in the press was that that was also the position of a large majority of the US population. And in fact, it had been about 2/3 of the popular opinion since April 2003, immediately, a couple of weeks after the invasion. About 2/3 of the population thought U.S. troops shouldn't be there, except under UN authority. Well, the difference between Spain and the United States is two. First of all, in Spain, people knew that that was popular opinion. In the United States, nobody knows, unless they do a research project. And secondly, in Spain, they could vote on it. In the United States, inconceivable. The political candidate would say, tells you something.
As an anarchist, how do you see the possibilities and duties of anarchism in this 21st century?
Well, first of all, we have to ask what anarchism is. Anarchism means a lot of different things that are used in every imaginable way. But there's one sort of constant thing, you get in all varieties of anarchism. And that is, and so it's kind of like a lowest common denominator, an important one. And what the basic conception of anarchism, which incidentally comes straight out of classical liberalism, is that anarchists are really the inheritors of classical liberalism. The theme is that hierarchy and domination are not self-legitimizing. They don't legitimize themselves like force. They don't legitimize themselves. Maybe you can justify them, but they have to give an argument. So if there's any form of hierarchy or domination, whether it's in a family or in international affairs or anything else, in a business, whatever it may be, university, whatever, you have to give an argument for it. Has to prove that it's legitimate. Okay, otherwise, it's illegitimate and you dismantle it. Okay, that's the basic conception. Well, if you take a look case by case, it's very hard to give arguments. I think there are cases where you can give arguments. They're not easy to find. So, for example, if I'm walking down the street with my 3-year-old granddaughter, and she runs into the street, and I grab her arm and pull her back, that's authority and domination. Okay, but I think I give an argument. And there are other cases where you can give an argument. Most of the time, it collapses. So anarchism is just that tendency in human life and thought which seeks to identify structures of domination, hierarchy, and oppression, and ask if they're legitimate. And if not legitimate, if they're not, undermined. Now that, to me, that's just the definition of progress. So does it have a future? Civilization has a future. And if it's, then the future should be based on this principle, among other things. So sure, it's a future.
I would like to make a little comment, more than a question, about what my friend was asking about social movements here in Chile. Because you were commenting that people in Chile have like grown up under like terror because of what happened in the 70s. But I would like to like correct that a little bit, because nowadays, especially this year, we have seen social movements, especially in students, like school students, 16-year boys, that have grown up with no terror and have made really big improvements in social movements. And I think, well, I'm sure that is because we all have been born in democracy more than dictatorship, like most of us. So I just would like to compliment with that.
Yeah, today, in fact. I mean, yeah, it can happen, but I think it's a long way to go. It's kind of striking that it's coming from the youngest.
But I was thinking that this is coming from the youngest people because they were born like in democracy.
Very possible.
That is not
The
like
threat of terror is not in your bones.
Yeah.
Sort of.
That's right.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that it's permanent, but it's palpable. You can feel it. It has to be overcome. My suspicion is, judging by other cases, that once it's challenged seriously, it's going to crumble. Because these structures of the psychology of terror is a very weak instrument. And it's not like a torture chamber. Torture chamber is hard to deal with, but the psychological effect of conformism is a much weaker means of control. I mean, and you find that over and over. I mean, let's take the United States, or most of the West, for example. The 1950s were a very conformist period. Nothing has happened. No popular movements, no activism. Cities, maybe terror was on the road. Essentially nothing. Very quiet period. In the 1960s, the whole place blew up, mostly from young people. And they made big changes, enormous changes. I don't know what Trinity College was like, but my university is a good example, MIT. Around 1960, there were maybe 2% women, no minorities. Today it's 50% women. I made a mistake about that last night when somebody asked me. Today it's 50% women, about a third minorities. Back in the 1960s, white males, well-dressed, ties and jackets, deferential, and so on. Today it's kind of like this. And those are that's not just symbolism, that means changes of relations and attitudes. And all in all, the country just became a lot more civilized in many respects. And there was no human rights movement in the 1960s. There were no solidarity movement. There was no women's movement. There were no environmental. There were no opposition to aggression. That changed very quickly. Sometimes, like almost overnight, in particular places, because the system of control is very fragile. I mean, it works when people accept it. Stop accepting it, it collapses. There's no life behind it. And yeah, you're right. People are doing some work.
I'm being told that the group, like, the usual view, the group would like to have it.